We all know the Supreme Court makes huge decisions, right? Decisions that literally shape our lives. But have you ever stopped to think, where does all that power actually come from? Well, today we're going to dig into the original blueprint, a document written over 2 centuries ago, to see how it built the very court we have today.
And to do that, to really get a handle on the court's immense authority, you have to go back to the source code. I'm talking about the original architectural plan for the entire judicial branch, Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution.
And you know, the very first sentence of Article 3, it just gets right to the point. No messing around. It doesn't suggest or propose anything. It establishes. It says, right there in black and white, that there will be one single highest court and that all the judicial power of the United States, it's going to be placed right there. And that word, vested, let's just pause on that for a second. It's a legal term, sure, but what it means is huge. It means this power isn't borrowed. It's not temporary. It's a fundamental, absolute right that's given directly to the Supreme Court. Honestly, that one single word is the bedrock of its entire authority.
Okay, now check this out. The blueprint goes on to say that judges shall hold their offices during good behavior. It sounds kind of old-fashioned, right? Good behavior? But believe me, this is one of the most important, most consequential lines in the whole document.
So, what does good behavior actually mean? Well, it effectively means a job for life, a lifetime appointment. And you have to ask, why would they do that? Well, the framers were trying to build a wall, a barrier between the judiciary and the, shifting winds of politics. The idea was, if you give justices a job for life, you insulate them from public pressure. They can make rulings based on the law, not just on what's popular that week.
Okay, so the blueprint gives the court all this power, and it gives the judges jobs for life. But power over what, exactly? What kind of cases are we talking about? For that, we've got to look at Section 2, where the Constitution lays out the court's jurisdiction in, honestly, incredible detail.
And when you look at the list, the scope is just massive. I mean, it's not just the big, headline-grabbing constitutional questions. It covers everything from international treaties and ambassadors all the way down to really specific stuff like maritime law and even fights between states. This list basically draws the map of the court's entire legal territory.
So that leads to a pretty important question. How does a case even get to the Supreme Court in the first place? Well, there are 2 main roads in. The superhighway, the one most cases take, is called appellate jurisdiction. That just means they've worked their way up, appealed from lower courts. But then there's this other, much smaller path for a very specific set of cases, like, say, a dispute between 2 states. For those, the Supreme Court is the first and only stop, and that's called original jurisdiction.
You know, it's pretty incredible when you think about that journey. It starts as an idea on parchment, ratified way back in 1788, and it becomes this real physical institution that we see today. And get this, for almost 150 years, the court didn't even have its own building. They were basically borrowing space. But now, it's this living, breathing part of our government with its own iconic home.
And speaking of that building, today actually marks the 90th anniversary of its ceremonial opening. It's a pretty cool milestone, and it's a great reminder that even though the blueprint is ancient, the institution it created is always evolving. It has its own, much more recent history, too.
So what does a day at the court actually look like? This is the blueprint in action right now. On a typical argument day, things are super structured and totally public. You've got attorneys presenting their cases, sure, but it's not a monologue. It's a really dynamic conversation, with the justices jumping in with questions constantly. You're literally listening to the nation's most complex legal debates play out in real time.
But the blueprint didn't just define the court's power. It also built in some really important protections against the abuse of that power. And you see this nowhere clearer than in its definition of the most serious crime you can imagine, treason. And look how specific, how narrow it is. They're making it clear, treason is not just disagreeing with the government. It is explicitly about waging war against the country or actively helping its enemies. That's it.
See, the founders had seen how the charge of treason was thrown around back in England to crush political opponents. They were deeply suspicious of it, so they made the bar for a conviction deliberately, almost impossibly high. You need 2 separate witnesses who saw the exact same act, or you need a confession right there in open court. That's a huge burden of proof, and it's totally on purpose.
And they didn't even stop there. The founders added another layer of protection, and this one uses language that sounds like it's straight out of Game of Thrones: corruption of blood.
So what on earth does that mean? Basically, it means guilt is individual. It doesn't spread to your family. Unlike in the old monarchies, where if you were convicted of treason, your whole family could be punished, lose their property, everything. The Constitution says, nope, the punishment dies with the person. Your family's legal rights, their bloodline, can't be corrupted by what you did.
So when you pull it all together, you can see that the original blueprint in Article 3, it's not just some dusty old historical document. It's alive. It directly shapes the court's power, its day-to-day procedures, and even these fundamental protections we've been talking about. It really is an idea made real. Every single day the court is in session.
And that really brings us to the big question, the one to leave you with. How can a document that's nearly 240 years old, a blueprint designed for a world with zero iPhones, no internet, no AI, how can that document continue to be the final word on our most modern, most complex debates? Well, that right there is both the enduring power and the central challenge of the Supreme Court.